Well, with the water system the way it's been this past week, we still had our higher water levels, which is a big deal. It's very important, at least for me anyway. I like the higher water and the tides that are in here, so that water's not really dropped a whole lot now that we're on the backside of the new moon. New moon phase in the past week was pretty good for the most part. Most days were pretty productive, but we still fishing around shale. Up here in Mesquite, there's this back shoreline. All the Ayers dugout area, you got lots of shell that's in and around that area. So if you fish that, you are quite well aware of all that. So we spent time around the shell, fishing over the top of that. Caught lots of trout, a lot of smaller fish that were in there. A lot of dinks, 12 to 14-inch fish were hanging out a lot of those areas. When we just get back here on the back shoreline where you got some nice hard pack and you got some of these little back bays that dump out into it, so you can kind of work those mouths. You can work back into these little lakes a little bit. Some of these are a little mushy more than others, but for the most part, they're all accessible. Not a problem to fish those. Had plenty of bait still working in the area. Again, just working down the shoreline, hitting the little shell bars and shell reefs that were all out in here. So that was, main thing was just trying to trout fish and see if we could find some better trout. But in and amongst all the smaller fish that we would catch, you would still find a handful in that we would come across, get a bait in front of them that you'd catch a 16 to 18-inch fish, which was fine. It was a good fish, especially if you're looking to keep a few of those. And then, of course, we hit the little shell bars that were out here, found some trout on those, worked our way back around as we went back into Bray Cove, the back lake back in here with the amount of water that's in here. So these back lakes really kind of light up. So we were looking primarily for redfish from back here, but come, to our surprise, pleasantly, we found our better trout back in these back lakes over that grass and stuff. And again, I mentioned before that there's still a lot of these trout that are developing eggs or still have eggs and that have dropped them. So they're still pretty plump. Now, once we get our first real cool front and come in, I know we had semblance of one that came in last week, dropped a bunch of rain for us, dropped the water temps just a few degrees. I think it dropped them down into 81, 82 degree temperatures, but it's rebounded toward the end of the week. As you got back to this past weekend, they were back up into the mid 80s, 84, 85. But our trout were hanging back in a lot of these areas here, and of course redfish as well. If you have been fishing, and depending on if you're close to some cuts that go out to the Gulf or some passes, you probably have noticed that there's been plenty of redfish pods, and those are gradually getting bigger as far as the amount of fish that are holding in those pods. So we're finding 50 to 100 in some of these pods, and they're all pretty quality redfish for the most part. They're all in that mid to upper slot. So a lot of fun catching those, and especially when they're sitting there hold for you and they don't spook after you catch one. You can catch a handful out of there pretty quick. We were throwing plastics primarily in a lot of these areas that were back in here. We sprinkled in a few of like in the back lakes, we would sprinkle in the topwater bait. A lot of floating grass, so it made it kind of difficult to contend with that. Now, if you've got topwater baits with single hooks, you could do a little bit better as far as not catching the grass. But if you were throwing it with treble, you get about 15 or 20 feet, and they were all caked up with the floating grass that was in there. So we just switched back to our regular plastics. Some people threw weedless setups, which is fine. The only kind of drawback to a weedless setup, your hookup ratio does go down somewhat. But you can still catch them on it, and it's still fine. Like I say, we just worked in around here past that little floater that's back there in Bray Cove, out around here to the point, back on this Madre shoreline, and just worked our way all the way down toward the mouth of Cedar Bayou on this through this area here. Now, this past Sunday, we had a little northwest wind, west northwest northeast wind. So these areas back here kind of set up really good for that type of wind setup. So, and with the extra water that's in their system, so there was a lot of fish that were cruising over the top of these flats that were out here. So we had really good redfish days back here, especially on Sunday. So it was really good this past Sunday. Primary baits Three baits we've kind of narrowed it down to that we're really throwing a lot of is the down south lures. We're throwing the knock and tail, and we're throwing the Pav lures, and we're sprinkling in a little bit of the mirror lure Little Johns in there. You know, especially around the new moon, we were throwing a little bit bigger profile baits. You know, the XLs, the 5-inch on the down south, and then of course what the knock and tail offers, and then Pav lures. They're 5 and 6-inch baits. They're rat tail. Primarily, that was the main baits that we were throwing this past week. Assorted colors. There wasn't really one color that really stood out that they're eating this particular one. You know, in the down south, it was the standard ones: is White Ice, Bone Diamond, Twisted Tea, Big Papa, Watermelon Red. Threw a lot of the original size too. There was a couple of days where they just really wanted just the 4-inch size bait, so we really fit into that original size, and the 5-inch in the Pav lures, and of course the knock and tails fits right into that profile as well. And then of course your Little John XL does that same profile. So we had a nice little variety of different baits and different flavors. The main baits in the knock and tail was the greenback. That one did, I remember, stood out that it was really pretty productive. A couple of the other colors that he has on those did okay as well, but the greenback was one that really stood out really well. In the Pav lures, he has a new bait that's out. I don't know that it's got a name to it just yet. It's pretty new. It'll probably hit the market here before too long. It's a black and gold rat tail, so it did really well, especially with redfish. They were really liking that particular flavor. And of course, when you get that north wind like that water will kind of stain a little bit, so that bait really stands out in that. So that was one that we really stuck out there and did really well with that. Again, throwing 16th ounce jig heads. A lot of the water that we were fishing this past week was, you know, waist deep, and then of course you could push up close to the shoreline. The one thing that we did notice about the redfish is they had lots of, the ones that we kept anyway, they had lots of little shad and small shrimp. So the shrimp are starting to migrate, and they're up in that grass, and the little shad are up in that grass. So that's where a lot of our fish came from. And they're sitting there rooting those suckers out of there, and they're just working down those shorelines. And you come across some that are tailing. So when you get that opportunity, it's a pretty cool scenario that you get to see. And, you know, you can basically sight cast those fish and throw it right in front of them and let them eat it. So it's a lot of fun to be able to do that. And so we had a couple of different days where we had opportunities where that came across, and we were set up for it. So we did have some pretty productive days this past week out on the water, especially up here on this back shoreline in the Matagorda area. We did work across over to the Cedar Flat area, worked on that grass line on this inside area, working all that. Around the little island there, and there's a nice little shell bar that's on that back side of there. If you fished that, you know where I'm talking about. Then just kind of continued and working up here, just picking potholes, just working around that. And you'd pull a fish out of one, pull a couple of fish out of the others. Wasn't a fish holding all the potholes, but there was plenty of fish to have an opportunity at. And so, again, when you get these higher tides that's in here, and I would imagine probably maybe this week that water's going to start to recede a little bit. It's going to start dropping out. So if you get the opportunity this upcoming week, just make sure you're checking those tides in there. Again, the majors and minors were the main thing that we were really catching our fish around. A couple of the days, the bite kind of extended, or maybe it started a little bit early. But that's the always make thing that you kind of put yourself in a position to where if you're going to fish around one of those time frames, that you give yourself plenty of time to be proactive in and around that time frame. So again, just pay attention to your upcoming weather patterns, because those things are going to probably start to change as we get closer to October, which is just a few days away. So October is typically when we'll get a decent little cool front that'll push in here. It won't be a big hard one, but it will be cooler. I know a couple of the mornings we were starting out at 68, 69 degrees, so that's a big difference where it's been. So anyhow, that's always something to factor into your fishing week, so make sure you take care of those. Back down in Spalding, all this area back in here, we run back down here, fish the back lakes in there, stayed on the outside. Of course, we fished some of the back lakes that were back in this areas here in Sherman's. Again, with that, again, with a lot of extra water that's in the system, these back lakes really light up. Those fish will push back in there. You're able to see sight cast some of them because the water was pretty clean for the most part because it's protected. Say the wind in the mornings in this past week were just about every day were fairly light. I mean, we'd have anywhere from 3 to 6 mile an hour winds. So if you're a sight caster, man, that's the time to be back in these back lakes because you can get back there and that water is really clean. Not a tremendous amount of floating grass in some of these until that wind really did kind of pick up. So you could get some opportunities back there. And we found a few pods of fish that were back in these areas here in Sherman's, worked our way back in some of these back lakes that are a little bit further back. But we try to work more outside of the back lake areas. We were working this outer shoreline because we were fishing right up on that shoreline. What I tell you on that last video, there's a lot of shrimp and little shad. I mean, they're not even 2 inches. And then the shrimp are even smaller than that. They're little bitty shrimp. And those just redfish bellies were just chunk full of those two particular things, the shad and the minnows. The shad and the shrimp. Every once in a while, you'd find a little small crab, but for the majority of it, it was shrimp. So just kind of looking at that early in the week, then the Marker 54 jerk shrimp, good bait to throw on there and just kind of work that in and around that. We had some good opportunities with that. Knock and Tail has a new shrimp that they've come out with. It's a segmented tail. It's a really good bait as well, and it's a little bit smaller. So we had a little bit more productivity with that particular bait. And they've got the same flavors in the shrimp that they do in their regular plastics. You know, they got the heavy metal roe. They've got the greenback. There's another one that's kind of an orangish flavor. I don't remember the name of it. But we were matching those with that water clarity being pretty protected back in this on the southeast shoreline, all the way down into Spalding Bight area. Of course, when that water does get up, I love to get back in these back lakes here. The one that kind of circles up a little island that goes back, and it goes way back in there. You can wade that sucker way back in there. It does get mushy in some spots. And, of course, this middle one that's here, there's like 4 or 5 back lake mouths that dump out. And then the one that's up in here, you can run your boat in there, but, again, you got some shell pads in there. If you're not sure about the path, come around into Carlos and run your boat up on the shoreline. Then you can just walk across the shore and get into this back lake, and you can work all this area back in here. We found some scattered redfish, no pods, just, 1s and 2s back in here, but they were some better fish. They were that mid-slot range, 24, 26. Not a lot of trout, but majority of redfish. And, of course, that's this time of year where you're going to find lots of redfish in a lot of these areas as they're trying to make their way out to the Gulf. But that's the same thing, same baits in the down south, same baits in the Knock and Tail, same thing. But if you want to incorporate with the amount of shrimp that are showing up out of these fish's bellies, it would be a good idea to get you one of those, either the Marker 54 jerk shrimp or the Knock and Tail segmented shrimp. They're both really good baits. Had some good productivity with those this past week as well, and it just kind of reaffirms our thought process. If that's what they're eating, and that's what we're going to offer them, so you get your opportunity. So, then we kind of worked our way back out here on the outside of Carlos, here on the point and the fingers, back down in that. A couple of the early mornings that were super light winds, you could get into those guts. They kind of fish kind of deep with the amount of water that was in our system, so we were just kind of fishing more off the edges of the top of the reefs that were in there, and just worked those guts, found fish that were scattered in there. Of course, mostly that was trout. There were occasional redfish that were in there too. But that was our game plans for when we were fishing these areas at that time of the day. So again, try to align a major or minor into those time frames when we were fishing those. Fish are still holding on the shell. Water temps have not dropped enough for that to be a major factor just yet. But again, we're fixing to be into October. Weather patterns are going to change, and we will probably see those cooler days ahead. So just kind of adjust your box accordingly. We're in the wild card days now, so that's going to another factor as far as profile and size. So just adjust your box and see what you got in there with that, and just kind of play around with some different things if you like. But the main patterns that we have been 4-inch baits have been the most productive. Back in the turtle pen area, I like to get back in here when that water is really up. This whole back shoreline. Of course, this shoreline that's right in this area here, you got a lot of scattered shell, and you got some decent mud that's in that area. And then that trend continues as you move on around. If you fish there, you've got the couple little back lakes that are here, and that's real muddy back in those areas. So be careful if you're going to wade those. But then once you get past that and you get on this back shoreline that continues on toward Copano Creek, this is a nice, long, easy wade that's back in there. When that water's pushed way up onto the shoreline like that, and it's all in the grass. And what we noticed back in here, we were throwing lots of plastics with some scattered in there with the shrimp and stuff that we had. The fish were up in the grass. I mean, we were throwing right on the edge of the grass line, and that's when our getting our opportunities. There wasn't a whole lot of fish hanging out in a little bit, off the shore. If you got more than 10 or 15 yards off the shoreline, you weren't going to get many opportunities. You find some dink trout that were out there, but if you were looking primarily for redfish or some better trout, they were all up in this. And again, the same scenario is the fish that clients kept out of here, the redfish wise, full of little bitty shrimp, full of the little shad, all in about that 1.5 to 2 inch range. So we just try to match what was going on with that. That's why I mentioned earlier about the Marker 54 jerk shrimp and the knock and tail shrimp that they have now. So both great baits that push up in here, and you got a lot of color selection there. You got a lot of the brown shrimp that are in there, of course, and then of course you got the gut that's back here, part of Copano Creek, and that opens up this whole back area back here with the amount of water that's back in here. So fish back in these areas here, working the shorelines. It gets pretty mushy in some of those areas back there, so just be careful if you're going to wade that. And of course, if you want to get all the way back up in the creek itself and run back, way back in here, you got little eddies that come back off of that, or push back off in little lakes that go back in there. You can, if your boat's skinny enough and you're brave enough, you can run a long way back up in there, but just make sure you pay attention to what your tide levels are, because when that water starts dumping, it gets pretty skinny in a hurry. But we stayed more in the deeper edges, or should I say on the edge of the shorelines there, and just working that, primarily in our thigh deep, waist deep water. And that's primarily, everything was, again, pushed up against the grass lines, and that's where we're pulling our fish out from. So that's something to be aware of as the week progresses, just to see if our water levels continue to hold. So make sure you're checking your tide reports. The 361 Fishing app is a great one to check. It's all in this area here, so it has great information accurately. It's pretty spot on. So if you get the opportunity to check that, do so. It's a great thing to have, especially on your phone. You can check a lot of stuff with that. So in your winds, again, winds were not a big factor this past week at all. So you had lots of mornings that were really good. And of course, the afternoons, they picked up a little bit, but nothing that was unmanageable by any means. And of course, we just continued this on down. Later in the week, we had some more east winds, east, northeast. Like I say, we got into Sunday, Monday fishing. We still had that north, northwest, north, northeast wind. So this area here really sets up good for that. If you're going to fish all this area, you got lots of good grass that's in there, plenty of bait that's hanging in these. So, like I say, fish is not going to do anything but get better, especially for the artificial world. We hammered through the summertime, got through the hot days. Not that there were that many, but there were plenty of warm days that were on the water. But we're fixing to start having cooler temperatures, and the artificial game is going to really start to get better and better and better as we move forward into the year. So again, October right around the corner. Make sure you adjust your bait boxes for the transition in the full moon phase. It'll be on us here in about 10 days. So all that factors into your fishing day, depending on where you're going to fish. This is just some of the areas we've had a lot of good success this past 5 or 6 days back in some of these areas that we've already shown you. So again, check your majors and minors that are going on. Make sure you incorporate those into your fishing day, and just make sure that you're paying attention to weather patterns. So just make sure that you're safe out on the water.